All right, we're going to look at monocots versus dicots for crop science today. So the big fancy word that you'll hear is monocotyledon versus dicotyledon. And it sounds really complicated, but it's not, and we'll get into all that. So there's classes of plants. Your main two classes is angiosperms and gymnosperms. The basic breakdown you can see on your screen there is angiosperms are flowering plants. Gymnosperms are non-flowering. It says usually involves reproduction through seeds. And we'll kind of get into these too. And you might be like, why in the world do we have to learn this stuff? This is very basic plant science pieces. The further you dive into anything with agronomy or botany or plants in general, it helps to understand this to better help your plants and, if in the crop world, get better yields. So if you look, the angiosperms, the one that we're going to worry about in particular, is the flowering plants. They're divided into the monocots and dicots. So it does say as the zygote grows in the embryo, the first leaves of the young plant develop and are called cotyledons. So this is, thinking about the seed that comes from whether you've opened a bean seed before or something like that. You've seen a seed somewhere in your life. As they grow and develop, those are the leaves basically that come out of the plant, and we'll do some seed dissection too, so you can kind of better see what we're talking about. Monocots, they only have one cotyledon or one true leaf that comes up first. So think of like corn, lily, grass plants. Honestly, they all look kind of like a grass plant when they start out for the monocots. So mono, think of one. Dicots, they have two cotyledons or leaves that come out. So I don't know if you've done this in elementary school where you have planted a bean seed. You've seen the bean will actually split, or the seed, and it splits pretty easily compared to something like a grass seed. Notice they also mention oaks on there as well. And this is an image to show you the difference. So the other kind of cool part about seeds is it doesn't matter how you plant them. As long as it's not too deep, they'll figure out where the sun is. And obviously the plant seeks that so it can do photosynthesis. So you can see they're showing you the examples here of monocot versus dicot. The dicot example looks like, most of the bean seeds we've planted. Maybe you did it in a styrofoam cup in an elementary classroom. They're a little bit more interesting to watch. And I think that's why teachers have picked that. And oftentimes as it grows and, bursts out of the soil, which in plant form, it doesn't seem as dramatic because it takes a long time for it to happen. But sometimes you'll still see that seed coat sitting on top of those two leaves that are still folded together and slowly coming out of the soil. But when it does that definite split like this, you can tell that it's a dicot versus the single leaf monocot. And typically, depending on the plant, but oftentimes your monocots have a more fibrous root, not as strong taproot like your dicots. All right, some different pieces here. So you have leaf venation pattern. Monocot tends to be parallel. This actually reminds me of a corn plant, the way the venation is parallel on that leaf. And then dicot has a net pattern. So some of these pieces in the biology of the plant actually affect the way it takes up nutrients, the way it, uses chemicals and other things that we try to give it to make it do better. So it's important to note these dicots versus monocots. So just like I said before, the roots. So monocot, this is a better example up here, tend to be a fibrous root. So if you think about if you've ever mowed lawn and accidentally gouged the grass, it's pretty easy to shred up a whole chunk of lawn because the roots are so fibrous compared to this dicot or taproot. This honestly looks like a chunk of tree that was ripped up, but they tend to have one strong big root that runs straight down from the main part of the plant. Flowering parts. So this is something you probably learned in elementary school where you have the complete parts of a flower. But notice this one talks about groupings. So monocots, they tend to have groups of 3. Dicots, they tend to have groups of 4 or 5. It just helps you identify them a little bit better. It doesn't really affect how they uptake nutrients or anything. It might affect the pollination piece though. And we tend to forget in a lab setting. I have actually done this where I had a tomato plant, totally forgot that I needed to pollinate it. The petals fell off, flower died, no tomatoes grew. So in a lab setting, you do have to manually pollinate. In the wild or in a field even, you have, animals, you have wind, lots of different pests, not really pests, but insects that will be pollinating for you. And you have to have, this is a great example of this lily on here, where you have a complete flower. You have the stamen, which is the male part, so all these little brown pieces. That's where the pollen is. So that is the anther on top of the filament. So this brown piece is called the anther. This big piece in the middle here is the female part called the pistil. I remember it as in she's a pistil, like that's just what sticks in my head. So you have the stigma on top, which is actually sticky. It's what helps the pollen stick to it. The style is basically the tube that leads down to the ovary, which basically transports that pollen to help fertilize the flower and produce more of that plant. Monocot versus dicot as far as the vascular bundle position. So monocot, they're scattered throughout the stem. Dicot arranged in a single, kind of like in a circle, so you can kind of see that's how that vascular tissue looks. So if you were to slice a chunk of the stem, it really affects how it absorbs nutrients. And keep in mind absorbing water even from the stem or through the roots up through the stem to keep the plant alive. Stem types. So you have herbaceous, which is kind of, so if you look, this is, you have a lily and this is a corn plant for the monocots. They tend to be a little bit weaker in the stalk. Might sound silly when you think of a corn plant, but it bends over pretty easily, kind of soft fibers compared to the dicot, which tend to be, it does say herbaceous or woody. This is an example like a tomato plant, but they can be soft, but they tend to have a stronger core to them. Yes, for our tomato plants, we tend to provide cages because the fruit we've caused them to grow becomes too heavy and it will cause the plant to bend over and break. Your other example they have is basically a tree. Remember, they listed an oak tree as one of their examples. Obviously, a big, thick, heavy stem involved there. All right, this is just showing you in summary kind of a nice visual of all these components together. So you have the characteristics of monocot on the left, on the right you have dicot. Notice, I think it's kind of funny, they're showing you the flower kind of, on the monocot tends to be a little bit finer flower. They have all the parts. They made the stigma really tiny on this and you still have the stamen. Comparing over here, that one just has a bigger stigma in comparison. Yes, it has petals, it has sepals. This is showing you the seed. So this looks kind of like a corn seed, probably hard for you to visualize because they kind of have the coloring backwards. If you were to break it down, it has more of a starch inside of the seed to feed the plant as it grows because only one single blade is coming out. Cotyledon, it tends to be an easy seed to split in half. And you can kind of see the leaf layout as you're looking at it. And they tend to both have a strong seed coat to protect it. It's kind of nature's protective coating so that the seed does not get damaged. So notice one leaf comes out, two leaves come out as it grows. This is that vascular bundle in the stem, tend to have all spread throughout the vascular tissue. Whereas, this is showing an example of like an oak tree with the wood and the rings as it grows. It tends to be a hardier stem on the dicot. Leaf venation, remember they're straight, they're parallel in the monocot, and then the dicot, they tend to have that vein structure to it. And you'll see that if you fertilize some plants, especially if you use Miracle-Gro in too heavy of a dosage, sometimes the leaf with the, dicots with the venation that's throughout the leaf, you might see blue streaks in it. And then you might want to back off because there can be too much of a good thing. So this is your basic monocot versus dicot, kind of starting us off with the different crops. Because you'll see that as they grow and change, they're very different plants. And it's just a basic stepping stone to learning more. This is also showing you, some of you are numbers people or like a nice chart like this. Some of you are very visual. So it's kind of showing you that same information just in a different format. And notice it says fibrous versus taproot. This one has a number of flowers. So on the monocots, you have 3s, and then in dicots, you have 4 or 5s. And that is it for monocot versus dicot. Thank you for listening.